And all the time I've been saying to myself, there but for the grace of God. And then I've told myself, this is a miracle. I don't deserve anything better than any of these people, but it has happened. Here I still am. So now, it's up to me to justify it. Somehow, it's made me feel closer to other people than I have ever done before. That's made me keep wondering all the time what I can do to help some of them. You see, we must do something to justify that miracle, Bill. I might have been any of those blind girls. You might have been any of these wandering men. There's nothing big we can do. But if we try to look after just a few and give them what happiness we can, we shall be paying back a little, just a tiny part of what we owe. You do see that, don't you, Bill? I turned it over in my mind for a minute or more. I think, I said, that that's the queerest argument I've heard today, if not ever. And yet it's right. Isn't it, Bill? I know it's right. I tried to put myself in the place of one of those blind girls, and I know. We hold the chance of as full a life as they can have, for some of them. Shall we give it them as part of our gratitude? Or shall we simply withhold it on account of the prejudices we've been taught? That's what it amounts to. I sat silently for a time. I had not a moment's doubt that Josella meant every word she said. I ruminated a little on the ways of purposeful, subversive-minded women like Florence Nightingale and Elizabeth Fry. You can't do anything with such women. And they so often turn out to have been right after all. Very well, I said at last. If that's the way you think it ought to be. But I hope— She cut me short. Oh, Bill, I knew you'd understand. Oh, I'm glad, so very glad. You've made me so happy. After a time, I hope— I began again. Josella patted my hand. You won't need to worry at all, my dear. I shall choose 2 nice, sensible girls. Oh, I said. We went on sitting there on the wall, hand in hand, looking at the dappled trees, but not seeing them very much. At least I wasn't. Then in the building behind us someone started up a gramophone playing a Strauss waltz. It was painfully nostalgic as it lilted through the empty courtyard. For an instant the road before us became the ghost of a ballroom, a swirl of colour, with the moon for a crystal chandelier. Josella slid off the wall. With her arms outstretched, her wrists and fingers rippling, her body swaying, she danced, light as a thistledown in a big circle in the moonlight. She came round to me, her eyes shining and her arms beckoning. And we danced, on the brink of an unknown future, to an echo from a vanished past. Chapter 8. Frustration. I was walking through an unknown deserted city where a bell rang dismally, and a sepulchral disembodied voice called in the emptiness, "The beast is loose. Beware. The beast is loose." When I woke to find that a bell really was ringing. It was a handbell that jangled with a brassy double clatter so harsh and startling that for a moment I could not remember where I was. Then, as I sat up still bemused, there came a sound of voices calling, "Fire!" I jumped just as I was from my blankets and ran into the corridor. There was a smell of smoke there, a noise of hurried feet, doors banging. Most of the sound seemed to come from my right, where the bell kept on clanging and the frightened voices were calling. So it was that way I turned and ran. A little moonlight filtered in through tall windows at the end of the passage, relieving the dimness just enough for me to keep to the middle of the way and avoid the people who were feeling their way along the walls. I reached the stairs. The bell was still clanging in the hall below. I made my way down as fast as I could through smoke that grew thicker. Near the bottom I tripped and fell forward. The dimness became a sudden darkness into which a light burst like a cloud of needles. And that was all. The first thing was an ache in my head. The next was a glare when I opened my eyes. At the first blink, it was as dazzling as a Klieg light, but when I started again and edged the lids up more cautiously, it turned out to be only an ordinary window, and grimy at that. I knew I was lying on a bed, but I did not sit up to investigate further. There was a piston pounding away in my head that discouraged any kind of movement. So I lay there quietly and studied the ceiling, until I discovered that my wrists were tied together. That snapped me out of my lethargy in spite of the thumping head. I found it a very neat job, not painfully tight, but perfectly efficient. Several turns of insulated wire on each wrist, and a complex knot on the far side where it was impossible for me to reach it with my teeth. I swore a bit and looked around. The room was small, and save for the bed on which I lay, empty. "Hey!" I called. "Anybody around here?" After half a minute or so there was a shuffle of feet outside. The door was opened and a head appeared. It was a small head with a tweed cap at the top of it. It had a stringy-looking choker beneath, and a dark unshavenness across its face. It was not turned straight at me, but in my general direction. "Hello, cook," it said, amiably enough. "So you've come too, have you? Hang on a bit, I'll get you a cup of char." And it vanished again. The instruction to hang on was superfluous, but I did not have to wait long. In a few minutes he returned, carrying a wire-handled can with some tea in it. "Where are you?" he said. "Straight ahead of you, on the bed," I told him. He groped forward with his left hand until he found the foot of the bed, then he felt his way around it and held out the can. "Here you are, chum. It'll taste a bit funny-like, 'cause old Charlie put a shot of rum in it, but I reckon you'll not mind that." I took it from him, holding it with some difficulty between my bound hands. It was strong and sweet, and the rum hadn't been stinted. The taste might be queer, but it worked like the elixir of life itself. "Thanks," I said. "You're a miracle worker. My name's Bill." His, it seemed, was Alf. "What's the line, Alf? What goes on here?" I asked him. He sat down on the side of the bed and held out a packet of cigarettes with a box of matches. I took one, lit his first, then my own, and gave him back the box. "It's this way, mate," he said. "You know there was a bit of a shindy up the university yesterday morning? Maybe you was there." I told him I'd seen it. "Well, after that lark, Coker, he's the chap that did the talking, he got kind of peeved. 'Okay,' he says, nasty-like. 'The buggers have asked for it. I put it to 'em fair and square in the first place. Now they can take what's coming to them.' Well, we'd met up with a couple of other fellas and one old girl what can still see, and they fixed it all up between them. He's a lad, that Coker." "You mean he framed the whole business? There wasn't any fire or anything?" I asked. "Fire, my Aunt Fanny. What they done was fix up a tripwire or two, light a lot of paper and sticks in the hall, and started ringing the old bell. We reckoned that them as could see would be the first along, on account of them being a bit of light still from the moon, and sure enough they was. Coker and another chap was giving them the KOs they tripped and passing them along to some of us chaps to carry out the lorry. Simple as kiss your hand." I said ruefully. "Sounds efficient, that Coker. How many of us mugs fell into that little trap?" "I'll say we got a couple of dozen, though it turned out as 5 or 6 of them was blinded. When we laid it up about all we'd room for in the lorry, we beat it and left the rest to sort themselves out."
End of Disc 4. Disc 5.
Whatever view Coker took of us, it was clear that Alf bore us no animosity. He appeared to regard the whole affair as a bit of sport. I found it a little too painful to class it so, but I mentally raised my hat to Alf. I'd a pretty good idea that in his position I'd be lacking the spirit to think of anything as a bit of sport. I finished the tea, and accepted another cigarette from him. "And what's the programme now?" I asked him. "Coker's idea is to make us all up into parties and put one of you with each party. You to look after the scrounging and kind of act as the eyes of the rest, like. Your job will be to help us keep going until somebody comes along to straighten this perishing lot out." "I see," I said. He cocked his head towards me. There weren't any flies on Alf. He had caught more in my tone than I had realized was there. "You reckon that's going to be a long time?" he said. "I don't know. What's Coker say?" Coker, it seemed, had not been committing himself to details. Alf had his own opinion, though. "If you ask me, I reckon there ain't nobody going to come. If there was, they'd have been here before this. Different if we was in some little town in the country, but London? Stands to reason they'd come here afore anywhere else. No, the way I see it, they ain't come yet, and that means they ain't never going to come, and that means there ain't nobody to come. Cool, blimey, who'd have ever thought it could happen like this?" I didn't say anything. Alf wasn't the sort to be jollied with facile encouragements. "Reckon that's the way you see it too," he said, after a bit. "Doesn't look so good," I admitted. "But there still is a chance, people from somewhere abroad." He shook his head. "They'd have come before this. They'd have had loudspeaker cars round the streets telling us what to do before this." "Nah, chum, we've had it. There ain't nobody nowhere to come, that's the fact of it." We were silent for a while, then. "Oh, well, it weren't a bad old life while it lasted," he said. We talked a little about the kind of life it had been for him. He'd had various jobs, each of which seemed to have included some interesting undercover work. He summed it up. "One way and another I didn't do so bad. What was your racket?" I told him. He wasn't impressed. "Triffids, huh? Nasty damn things, I reckon. Not natural, as you might say." We left it at that. Alf went away, leaving me to my cogitations and a packet of his cigarettes. I surveyed the outlook and thought little of it. I wondered how the others would be taking it, particularly what would be Josella's view. I got off the bed and went across to the window. The prospect was poor. An interior well with sheer white-tiled sides for 4 stories below me, and a glass skylight at the bottom. There wasn't much to be done that way. Alf had locked the door after him, but I tried it just in case. Nothing in the room gave me inspiration. It had the look of belonging in a third-rate hotel, except that everything save the bed had been thrown out. I sat down again on the bed and pondered. I could perhaps tackle Alf successfully, even with my hands tied, providing he had no knife. But probably he had a knife, and that would be unpleasant. It would be no good a blind man threatening me with a knife. He would have to use it to disable me. Besides, there would be the difficulty of discovering what others I would have to pass before I could find my way out of the building. Moreover, I did not wish Alf any harm. It seemed wiser to wait for an opportunity. One was bound to come to a sighted man among the sightless. An hour later, Alf came back with a plate of food, a spoon, and more tea. "Bit rough-like," he apologized. "But they said no knife or fork, so there it is." While I was tackling it, I asked about the others. He couldn't tell me much and didn't know any names, but I found out that there had been women as well as men among those that had been brought here. After that, I was left alone for some hours, which I spent doing my best to sleep off the headache. When Alf reappeared with more food and the inevitable can of tea, he was accompanied by the man he had called Coker. He looked more tired now than when I had seen him before. Under his arm he carried a bundle of papers. He gave me a searching look. "You know the idea?" he asked. "What Alf's told me," I admitted. "All right, then." He dropped his papers on the bed, picked up the top one and unfolded it. It was a street plan of Greater London. He pointed to an area covering part of Hampstead and Swiss Cottage, heavily outlined in blue pencil. "That's your beat," he said. "Your party works inside that area and not in anyone else's area. You can't have each lot going after the same pickings. Your job is to find the food in that area and see that your party gets it. That, and anything else they need. Got that?" "Or what?" I said, looking at him. "Or they'll get hungry. And if they do, it'll be just too bad for you. Some of the boys are tough, and we're not any of us doing this for fun. So what's your step? Tomorrow morning we'll run you and your lot up there in lorries. After that, it'll be your job to keep 'em going until somebody comes along to tidy things up." "And if nobody does come?" I asked. "Somebody's got to come," he said grimly. "Anyway, there's your job, and mind you keep to your area." I stopped him as he was on the point of leaving. "Have you got a Miss Playton here?" I asked. "I don't know any of your names," he said. "Fair-haired, about 5'6" or 7, grey-blue eyes," I persisted. "There's a girl about that size and blonde, but I haven't looked at her eyes. Got something more important to do," he said as he left. I studied the map. I was not greatly taken with the district allotted to me. Some of it was a salubrious enough suburb indeed, but in the circumstances a location that included docks and warehouses would have had more to offer. It was doubtful whether there would be any sizable storage depots in this part. Still, can't all have a prize, as Alf would doubtless express it, and anyway I had no intention of staying there any longer than was strictly necessary. When Alf showed up again, I asked him if he would take a note to Josella. He shook his head. "Sorry, mate. Not allowed." I promised him it should be harmless, but he remained firm. I couldn't altogether blame him. He had no reason to trust me and would not be able to read the note to know that it was as harmless as I claimed. Anyway, I'd neither pencil nor paper, so I gave that up. After pressing, he did consent to let her know that I was here, and to find out the district to which she was being sent. He was not keen on doing that much, but he had to allow that if there were to be any straightening out of the mess, it would be a lot easier for me to find her again if I knew where to start looking. After that, I had simply my thoughts for company for a bit. The trouble was that I was not wholeheartedly set on any course. There was a damnable ability to see the points on both sides. I knew that common sense and the long-term view backed up Michael Beadley and his lot. If they had started, Josella and I would doubtless have gone with them and worked with them, and yet I knew I would have been uneasy. I'd never be quite convinced that nothing could have been done for the sinking ship, never quite sure that I had not rationalized my own preference. If, indeed, there was no possibility of organized rescue, then their proposal to salvage what we could was the intelligent course. But unfortunately, intelligence is by no means the only thing that makes the human wheels go round. I was up against the very conditioning that the old doctor had said was so hard to break. He was dead right about the difficulty of adopting new principles. If, for instance, some kind of relief should miraculously arrive, I knew just what kind of a louse I'd feel to have cleared out, whatever the motives, and just how much I'd despise myself and the rest for not having stayed here in London to help for as long as it was possible. But if, on the other hand, help did not come, how would I have felt about having wasted my time and frittered my efforts away, when stronger-minded people had started getting on with the salvage while the going was good? I knew I ought to make my mind up once and for all on the right course and stick to it. But I could not. I seesawed. Some hours later, when I fell asleep, I was still seesawing. There was no means of knowing which way Josella had made up her mind. I'd had no personal message from her. But Alf had put his head in once during the evening. His communication had been brief. "Westminster," he said. "Cool. Don't reckon that lot's going to find much grub in the Houses of Parliament." I was woken by Alf coming in early the following morning. He was accompanied by a bigger, shifty-eyed man who fingered a butcher's knife with unnecessary ostentation. Alf advanced and dropped an armful of clothes on the bed. His companion shut the door and leaned against it, watching with a crafty eye and toying with the knife. "Give us your mitts, mate," said Alf. I held my hands out towards him. He felt for the wires on my wrists and snipped them with a cutter. "Now just you put on that there clobber, chum," he said, stepping back. I got myself dressed while the knife fancier followed every movement I made like a hawk. When I'd finished, Alf produced a pair of handcuffs. "There's just these," he mentioned. I hesitated. The man by the door ceased to lean on it and brought his knife forward a little. For him, this was evidently the interesting moment. I decided maybe it was not the time to try anything and held my wrists out. Alf felt around and clicked on the cuffs. After that, he went and fetched me my breakfast. Nearly 2 hours later, the other man turned up again, his knife well in evidence. He waved it at the door. "Come on," he said. It was the only remark I ever heard him make. With the consciousness of the knife producing an uncomfortable feeling in my back, we went down a number of flights of stairs and across a hall. In the street, 2 loaded lorries were waiting. Coker, with 2 companions, stood by the tailboard of one. He beckoned me over. Without saying anything, he passed a chain between my arms. At each end of it was a strap. One was fastened already around the left wrist of a burly, blind man beside him. The other he attached to the right wrist of a similar tough case, so that I was between them. They weren't taking any unavoidable chances. "I'd not try any funny business if I were you," Coker advised me. "You do right by them, and they'll do right by you." The 3 of us climbed awkwardly onto the tailboard, and the 2 lorries drove off. We stopped somewhere near Swiss Cottage and piled out. There were perhaps 20 people in sight, prowling with apparent aimlessness along the gutters. At the sound of the engines, every one of them had turned towards us with an incredulous expression on his face, and as if they were parts of a single mechanism, they began to close hopefully towards us, calling out as they came. The drivers shouted to us to get clear. They backed, turned, and rumbled off by the way we had come. The converging people stopped. 1 or 2 of them shouted after the lorries. Most turned hopelessly and silently back to their wandering. There was one woman about 50 yards away. She broke into hysterics and began to bang her head against a wall. I felt sick. I turned towards my companions. "Well, what do you want first?" I asked them. "A billet," said one. "We've got to have some place to doss down." I reckoned I'd have to find that at least for them. I couldn't just dodge out and leave them stranded right where we were. Now we'd come this far, I couldn't do less than find them a centre, a kind of headquarters, and put them on their feet. What was wanted was a place where the receiving, storing, and feeding could be done, and the whole lot kept together. I counted them. There were 52, 14 of them women. The best course seemed to be to find a hotel. It would save the trouble of fitting out with beds and bedding. The place we found was a kind of glorified boarding house made up of 4 Victorian terrace houses knocked together, giving more than the accommodation we needed. There were already 6 people in the place when we got there. Heaven knows what had happened to the rest. We found the remnant huddled together and scared in one of the lounges. An old man, an elderly woman, who turned out to have been the manageress, a middle-aged man, and 3 girls. The manageress had the spirit to pull herself together and hand out some quite high-sounding threats, but the ice, even of her most severe boarding-house manner, was thin. The old man tried to back her up by blustering a bit. The rest did nothing but keep their faces turned nervously towards us. I explained that we were moving in. If they did not like it, they could go. If, on the other hand, they preferred to stay and share equally what there was, they were free to do so. They were not pleased. The way they reacted suggested that somewhere in the place they had a cache of stores that they were not anxious to share. When they grasped that the intention was to build up bigger stores, their attitude modified perceptibly, and they prepared to make the best of it. I decided I'd have to stay on a day or 2 just to get the party set up. I guessed Josella would be feeling much the same about her lot. Ingenious man, Coker. The trick is called holding the baby. But after that, I'd dodge out and join her. During the next couple of days we worked systematically, tackling the bigger stores nearby, mostly chain stores and not very big at that. Nearly everywhere there had been others before us. The fronts of the shops were in a bad way. The windows were broken in, the floors were littered with half-open cans and spilt packages which had disappointed the finders, and now lay in a sticky, stinking mass among the fragments of window glass. But as a rule the loss was small and the damage superficial, and we'd find the larger cases in and behind the shop untouched. It was far from easy for blind men to carry and manoeuvre heavy cases out of the place and load them onto handcarts. Then there was the job of getting them back to the billet and stowing them, but practice began to give them a knack with it. The most hampering factor was the necessity for my presence. Little or nothing could go on unless I was there to direct. It was impossible to use more than one working party at a time, though we could have made up a dozen. Nor could much go on back at the hotel while I was out with foraging squads. Moreover, such time as I had to spend investigating and prospecting the district was pretty much wasted for everyone else. 2 sighted men could have got through a lot more than twice the work. Once we had started, I was too busy during the day to spend much thought beyond the actual work in hand, and too tired at night to do anything but sleep the moment I lay down. Now and again I'd say to myself, by tomorrow night I'll have them pretty well fixed up, enough to keep them going for a bit anyway. Then I'll light out of this and find Josella. That sounded all right, but every day it was tomorrow that I'd be able to do it, and each day it became more difficult. Some of them had begun to learn a bit, but still practically nothing from foraging to can opening could go on without my being around. It seemed, the way things were going, that I became less instead of more dispensable. None of it was their fault. That was what made it difficult. Some of them were trying so damned hard. I just had to watch them, making it more and more impossible for me to play the skunk and walk out on them. A dozen times a day I cursed the man Coker for contriving me into the situation. But that didn't help to solve it. It just left me wondering how it could end. I had my first inkling of that, though I scarcely recognized it as such, on the 4th morning, or maybe it was the 5th, just as we were setting out. A woman called down the stairs that there were 2 sick out there. Pretty bad, she thought. My 2 watchdogs did not like it. Listen, I told them, I've had about enough of this chain gang stuff. We'd be doing a lot better than we are now without it anyway. And have you slinking off to join your old mob? Said someone. I'd not fool yourself, I said. I could have slugged this pair of amateur guerrillas any hour of the day or night. I've not done it because I've got nothing against them other than their being a pair of dim-witted nuisances. Here, one of my attachments began to expostulate. But, I went on, if they don't let me see what's wrong with these people, they can begin expecting to be slugged any minute from now. The 2 saw reason, but when we reached the room, they took good care to stand as far back as the chain allowed. The casualties turned out to be 2 men, one young, one middle-aged. Both had high temperatures and complained of agonized pain in the bowels. I didn't know much about such things then, but I did not need to know much to feel worried. I could think of nothing but to direct that they should be carried to an empty house nearby, and to tell one of the women to look after them as best she could. That was the beginning of a day of setbacks. The next, of a very different kind, happened around noon. We had cleared most of the food shops close to us, and I had decided to extend our range a little. From my recollections of the neighbourhood, I reckoned we ought to find another shopping street above half a mile to the north, so I led my party that way. We found the shop there all right, but something else, too. As we turned the corner and came into view of them, I stopped. In front of a chain-store grocery, a party of men were trundling out cases and loading them onto a lorry. Save for the differences in the vehicle, I might have been watching my own party at work. I halted my group of 20 or so, wondering what line we should take. My inclination was to withdraw and avoid possible trouble by finding a clear field elsewhere. There was no sense in coming into conflict when there was plenty scattered in various stores for those who were organized enough to take it. But it did not fall to me to make the decision. Even while I hesitated, a red-headed young man strode confidently out of the shop door. There was no doubt that he was able to see, or, a moment later, that he had seen us. He did not share my indecisions. He reached swiftly for his pocket. The next moment a bullet hit the wall beside me with a smack. There was a brief tableau, his men and mine turning their sightless eyes towards one another in an effort to understand what was going on. Then he fired again. I supposed he had aimed at me, but the bullet found the man on my left. He gave a grunt as though he was surprised, and folded up with a kind of sigh. I dodged back round the corner, dragging the other watchdog with me. "Quick!" I said. "Give me the key to these cuffs. I can't do a thing like this." He didn't do anything except give a knowing grin. He was a one-idea man. "Huh," he said. "Come off it, you don't fool me." "Oh, for God's sake, you damned clown!" I said, pulling on the chain to drag the body of watchdog number 1 nearer so that we could get better cover. The goons started to argue. Heaven knows what subtleties his dim wits were crediting me with. There was enough slack on the chain now for me to raise my arms. I did, and hammered both fists at his head so that it went back against the wall with a crack. That disposed of his argument. I found the key in his side pocket. "Listen," I told the rest. "Turn round, all of you, and keep going straight ahead. Don't separate, or you'll have had it. Get moving now." I got one wristlet open, ridded myself of the chain, and scrambled over the wall into somebody's garden. I crouched there while I got rid of the other cuff. Then I moved across to peer cautiously over the far angle of the wall. The young man with the pistol had not come rushing after us, as I had half expected. He was still with his party, giving them an instruction. And now I came to think of it. Why should he hurry? Since we had not fired back at him, he could reckon we were unarmed, and we wouldn't be able to get away fast. When he'd finished his directions, he walked out confidently into the road to a point where he had a view of my retreating group, and then began to follow them. At the corner, he stopped to look at the two prone watchdogs. Probably the chain suggested to him that one of them had been the eyes of our gang, for he put the pistol back in his pocket and began to follow the rest in a leisurely fashion. That wasn't what I had expected, and it took me a minute to see his scheme. Then it came to me that his most profitable course would be to follow them to our headquarters and see what pickings he could hijack there. He was, I had to admit, either much quicker than I at spotting chances, or he had previously given more thought to the possibilities that might arise than I had. I was glad that I'd told my lot to keep straight on. Most likely they'd get tired of it after a bit, but I reckoned they'd none of them be able to find the way back to the hotel and so lead him to it. As long as they kept together, I'd be able to collect them all later on without much difficulty. The immediate question was what to do about a man who carried a pistol and didn't mind using it. In some parts of the world, one might go into the first house in sight and pick up a convenient firearm. Hampstead was not like that. It was a highly respectable suburb, unfortunately. There might possibly be a sporting gun to be found somewhere, but I would have to hunt for it. The only thing I could think of was to keep him in sight and hope that some opportunity would offer a chance to deal with him. I broke a branch off a tree, scrambled back over the wall, and began to tap my way along the curb, looking, I hoped, indistinguishable from the hundreds of blind men one had seen wandering the streets in the same way. The road ran straight for some distance. The red-headed young man was perhaps 50 yards ahead of me, and my party another 50 ahead of him. We continued like that for something over half a mile. To my relief, none of the front party showed any tendency to turn into the road which led to our base. I was beginning to wonder how long it would be before they decided that they had gone far enough, when an unexpected diversion occurred. One man who had been lagging behind the rest finally stopped. He dropped his stick and doubled up with his arms over his belly. Then he sank to the ground and lay there, rolling with pain. The others did not stop for him. They must have heard his moans, but probably they had no idea he was one of themselves. The young man looked towards him and hesitated. He altered his course and bore across towards the contorted figure. He stopped a few feet away from him and stood gazing down. For perhaps a quarter of a minute he regarded him carefully. Then slowly, but quite deliberately, he pulled his pistol out of his pocket and shot him through the head. The party ahead stopped at the sound of the shot. So did I. The young man made no attempt to catch up with them. In fact, he seemed suddenly to lose interest in them altogether. He turned round and came walking back down the middle of the road. I remembered to play my part and began to tap my way forward again. He paid no attention as he passed, but I was able to see his face. It was worried, and there was a grim set to his jaw. I kept going as I was until he was a decent distance behind me, then I hurried on to the rest. Brought up short by the sound of the shot, they were arguing whether to go on further or not. I broke that off by telling them that now I was no longer encumbered with my 2 IQ- watchdogs, we would be ordering things differently. I was going to get a lorry, and I would be back in 10 minutes or so to run them back to the billet in it. The finding of another organized party at work produced a new anxiety, but we found the place intact. The only news they had for me was that 2 more men and a woman had been taken with severe belly pains and removed to the other house. We made what preparations we could for defence against any marauders arriving while I was away. Then I picked a new party, and we set off in the lorry, this time in a different direction. I recalled that in former days when I had come up to Hampstead Heath, it had often been by way of a bus terminus where a number of small shops and stores clustered. With the aid of the street plan, I found the place again easily enough. Not only found it, but discovered it to be marvellously intact. Save for 3 or 4 broken windows, the area looked simply as if it had been closed up for a weekend. But there were differences. For one thing, no such silence had ever before hung over the locality, weekday or Sunday. And there were several bodies lying in the street. By this time one was becoming accustomed enough to that to pay them little attention. I had in fact wondered that there were not more to be seen, and had come to the conclusion that most people sought some kind of shelter either out of fear, or later when they became weak. It was one of the reasons that one felt a disinclination to enter any dwelling house. I stopped the lorry in front of a provision store and listened for a few seconds. The silence came down on us like a blanket. There was no sound of tapping sticks, not a wanderer in sight. Nothing moved. "Okay," I said. "Pile out, chaps." The locked door of the shop gave way easily. Inside there was a neat, unspoiled array of tubs of butter, cheeses, sides of bacon, cases of sugar, and all the rest of it. I got the others busy. They had developed tricks of working by now and were more sure of their handling. I was able to leave them to get on with it for a bit while I examined the back storeroom and then the cellar. It was while I was below, investigating the nature of the cases down there, that I heard a sound of shouts somewhere outside. Close upon it came a thunder of trampling boots on the floor above me. One man came down through the trap door and pitched on his head. He did not move or make another sound. I jumped to it that there must be a battle with a rival gang in progress up there. I stepped across the fallen man and climbed the ladder-like stair cautiously, holding up one arm to protect my head. The first view was of numerous scuffling boots unpleasantly close and backing towards the trap. I nipped up quickly and got clear before they were on me. I was up just in time to see the plate-glass window in the front give way. 3 men from outside fell in with it. A long green lash whipped after them, striking one as he lay. The other 2 scrambled among the wreckage of the display and came stumbling further into the shop. They pressed back against the rest, and 2 more men fell through the open trap door. It did not need more than a glimpse of that lash to tell what had happened. During the work of the past few days I had all but forgotten the Triffids. By standing on a box, I could see over the heads of the men. There were 3 Triffids in my field of view, 1 out in the road, and 2 closer on the pavement. 4 men lay on the ground out there, not moving. I understood then why these shops had been untouched, and why there had been no one to be seen in the neighbourhood of the heath. At the same time, I cursed myself for not having looked at the bodies in the road more closely. One glimpse of a sting mark would have been enough warning. "Hold it!" I shouted. "Stay where you are!" I jumped down from the box, pushed away the men who were standing on the folded-back lid of the trap, and got it closed. "There's a door back here," I told them. "Take it easy now." The first 2 took it easy. Then a Triffid sent its sting whistling into the room through the broken window. 1 man gave a scream as he fell. The rest came on in panic and swept me before them. There was a jam in the doorway. Behind us, stings swished twice again before we were clear. In the back room I looked round panting. There were 7 of us there. "Hold it," I said again. "We're all right in here." I went back to the door. The rear part of the shop was out of the Triffids' range, as long as they stayed outside. I was able to reach the trapdoor in safety and raise it. The 2 men who had fallen down there since I left re-emerged. One nursed a broken arm. The other was merely bruised and cursing. Behind the back room lay a small yard, and across that a door in an 8-foot brick wall. I had grown cautious. Instead of going straight to the door, I climbed on the roof of an outhouse to prospect. The door, I could see, gave into a narrow alley running the full length of the block. It was empty. But beyond the wall on the far side, which seemed to terminate the gardens of a row of private houses, I could make out the tops of 2 Triffids motionless among the bushes. There might well be more. The wall on that side was lower, and their height would enable them to strike right across the alley with their stings. I explained to the others. "Bloody unnatural brutes," said one. "I always did hate them bastards." I investigated further. The building next but one to the north side turned out to be a car hire service with 3 of its cars on the premises. It was an awkward job getting the party over the 2 intervening walls, particularly the man with the broken arm, but we managed it. Somehow, too, I got them all packed into a large Daimler. When we were all set, I opened the outer doors of the place and ran back to the car. The Triffids weren't slow to be interested. That uncanny sensitiveness to sounds told them something was happening. As we drove out, a couple of them were already lurching towards the entrance. Their stings whipped out at us and slapped harmlessly against the closed windows. I swung hard round, bumping one and toppling it over. Then we were away up the road, making for a healthier neighbourhood. The evening that followed was the worst I had spent since the calamity occurred. Freed of the 2 watchdogs, I took over a small room where I could be alone. I put 6 lighted candles in a row on the mantel-shelf, and sat a long while in an armchair trying to think things out. We had come back to find that one of the men who had been taken sick the night before was dead. The other was obviously dying, and there were 4 new cases. By the time our evening meal was over, there were 2 more still. What the complaint was, I had no idea. With the lack of service and the way things were going in general, it might have been a number of things. I thought of typhoid, but I'd a hazy idea that the incubation period ruled that out. Not that it would have made much difference if I had known. All I did know about it was that it was something nasty enough to make that red-haired young man use his pistol and change his mind about following my party. It began to look to me as if I had been doing my group a questionable service from the first. I had succeeded in keeping them alive, placed between a rival gang on one side, and Triffids encroaching from the heath on the other. Now there was this sickness too. And when all was said and done, I had achieved only the postponement of starvation for a little while. As things were now, I did not see my way. And then there was Josella on my mind. The same sort of things, maybe worse, were as likely to be happening in her district. I found myself thinking of Michael Beadley and his lot again. I had known then that they were logical. Now I began to think that perhaps they had a truer humanity too. They had seen that it was hopeless to try to save any but a very few. To give an empty hope to the rest was little better than cruelty. Besides, there were ourselves. If there were purpose in anything at all, what had we been preserved for? Not simply to waste ourselves on a forlorn task, surely. I decided that tomorrow I would go in search of Josella, and we would settle it together. The latch of the door moved with a click. The door itself opened slowly. "Who's that?" I said.
"Oh, it is you,"
said a girl's voice. She came in, closing the door behind her. "What do you want?" I asked. She was tall and slim. Under 20, I guessed. Her hair waved slightly, chestnut-coloured it was. She was quiet, but one had to notice her. It was the texture of her, as well as the line. She had placed my position by my movement and voice. Her gold-brown eyes were looking just over my left shoulder. Otherwise, I'd have been sure she was studying me. She did not answer at once. It was an uncertainty which did not seem to suit the rest of her. I went on waiting for her to speak. A lump got into my throat somehow. You see, she was young, and she was beautiful. There should have been all life, maybe a wonderful life, before her. And isn't there something a little sad about youth and beauty in any circumstances? "You're going to go away from here?" she said. It was half question, half statement, in a quiet voice, a little unsteadily. "I've never said that," I countered. "No," she admitted. "But that's what the others are saying. And they're right, aren't they?" I did not say anything to that. She went on. "You can't. You can't leave them like this. They need you." "I'm doing no good here," I told her. "All the hopes are false." "But suppose they turned out not to be false?" "They can't. Not now. We'd have known by this time." "But if they did, after all, and you had simply walked out?" "Do you think I haven't thought of that? I'm not doing any good, I tell you. I've been like the drugs they inject to keep the patient going a little longer. No curative value, just putting it off." She did not reply for some seconds. Then she said, unsteadily, "Life is very precious. Even like this." Her control almost cracked. I could not say anything. She recovered herself. "You can keep us going. There's always a chance, just a chance that something may happen, even now." I had already said what I thought about that. I did not repeat it. "It's so difficult," she said, as though to herself. "If I could only see you, but then, of course, if I could... Are you young? You sound young." "I'm under 30, I told her, "and very ordinary." "I'm 18. It was my birthday, the day the comet came." I could not think of anything to say to that would not seem cruel. The pause drew out. I saw that she was clenching her hands together. Then she dropped them to her sides, the knuckles quite white. She made as if to speak, but did not. "What is it?" I asked. "What can I do except prolong this a little?" She bit her lip, then... They said perhaps you were lonely," she said. "I thought perhaps if—" Her voice faltered and her knuckles went a little whiter still. "Perhaps if you had somebody, I mean, somebody here, you might not want to leave us. Perhaps you'd stay with us." "Oh, God," I said softly. I looked at her, standing quite straight, her lips trembling slightly. There should have been suitors clamouring for her lightest smile. She should have been happy and uncaring for a while. Then happy in caring. Life should have been enchanting to her, and love very sweet. "You'd be kind to me, wouldn't you?" she said. "You see, I haven't—" "Stop it! Stop it!" I told her. "You mustn't say these things to me. Please go away now." But she did not go. She stood staring at me from eyes that could not see me. "Go away!" I repeated. I could not stand the reproach of her. She was not simply herself, she was thousands upon thousands of young lives destroyed. She came closer. "Why, I believe you're crying," she said. "Go away! For God's sake, go away!" I told her. She hesitated. Then she turned and felt her way back to the door. As she went out, "You can tell them I'll be staying," I said. The first thing I was aware of the next morning was the smell. There had been whiffs of it here and there before, but luckily the weather had been cool. Now I found that I had slept late into what was already a warmer day. I'm not going into details about the smell. Those who knew it will never forget it, for the rest of it is indescribable. It rose from every city and town for weeks, and travelled on every wind that blew. When I woke to it that morning, It convinced me beyond doubt that the end had come. Death is just the shocking end of animation. It is dissolution that is final. I lay for some minutes thinking. The only thing to do now would be to load my party into lorries and take them in relays into the country. And all the supplies we had collected? They would have to be loaded and taken too, and I, the only one able to drive, it would take days, if we had days. Upon that, I wondered what was happening in the building now. The place was oddly quiet. When I listened, I could hear a voice groaning in another room. Beyond that, nothing. I got out of bed and hurried into my clothes with a feeling of alarm. Out on the landing, I listened again. There was no sound of feet about the house. I had a sudden nasty feeling as if history were repeating itself and I were back in the hospital again. "Hey! Anybody here?" I called. Several voices answered. I opened a nearby door. There was a man in there. He looked very bad, and he was delirious. There was nothing I could do. I closed the door again. My footsteps sounded loud on the wooden stairs. On the next floor, a woman's voice called, "Bill! Bill!" She was in bed in a small room there, the girl who had come to see me the night before. She turned her head as I came in. I saw that she had it too. "Don't come near," she said. "It is you, Bill." "Yes." "I thought it must be. You can still walk. They have to creep." "I'm glad, Bill. I told them you'd not go like that, but they said you had. Now they've all gone. All of them that could." "I was asleep," I said. "What happened?" "More and more of us like this. They were frightened." I said helplessly, "What can I do for you? Is there anything I can get you?" Her face contorted. She clutched her arms round her and writhed. The spasm passed and left her with sweat trickling down her forehead. "Please, Bill. I'm not very brave. Could you get me something to finish it?" "Yes," I said. "I can do that for you." I was back from the chemist's in 10 minutes. I gave her a glass of water and put the stuff in her other hand. She held it there a little. Then, "So futile. And it might all have been so different," she said. "Goodbye, Bill. Thank you for trying." I looked down at her lying there. There was a thing that made it still more futile. I wondered how many would have said, "Take me with you," where she had said, "Stay with us." And I never even knew her name. Chapter 9. Evacuation. It was the memory of the red-headed young man who had fired on us that conditioned my choice of a route to Westminster. Since I was 16, my interest in weapons has decreased. But in an environment reverting to savagery, it seemed that one must be prepared to behave more or less as a savage, or possibly cease to behave at all before long. In St. James's Street there used to be several shops which would sell you any form of lethalness from a rook rifle to an elephant gun with the greatest urbanity. I left there with a mixed feeling of support and banditry. Once more I had a useful hunting knife. There was a pistol with the precise workmanship of a scientific instrument in my pocket. On the seat beside me rested a loaded 12-bore and boxes of cartridges. I had chosen a shotgun in preference to a rifle. The bang is no less convincing, and it decapitates a Triffid with a neatness which a bullet seldom achieves. And there were Triffids to be seen, right in London now. They still appeared to avoid the streets when they could, but I had noticed several lumbering across Hyde Park, and there were others in Green Park. Very likely they were ornamental, safely docked specimens. On the other hand, maybe they weren't. And so I came to Westminster. The deadness, the finish of it all, was italicized there. The usual scatter of abandoned vehicles lay about the streets. Very few people were in sight. I saw only 3 who were moving. 2 were tapping their way down the gutters of Whitehall, the 3rd was in Parliament Square. He was sitting close to Lincoln's statue and clutching to him his dearest possession, a side of bacon, from which he was hacking a ragged slice with a blunt knife. Above it all rose the Houses of Parliament, with the hands of the clock stopped at 3 minutes past 6. It was difficult to believe that all that meant nothing any more, that now it was just a pretentious confection in uncertain stone which could decay in peace. Let it shower its crumbling pinnacles onto the terrace as it would, there would be no more indignant members complaining of the risk to their valuable lives. Into those halls which had in their days set world echoes to good intentions and sad expediencies, the roofs could in due course fall. There would be none to stop them, and none to care. Alongside the Thames flowed imperturbably on. So it would flow until the day the embankments crumbled, and the water spread out, and Westminster became once more an island in a marsh. Marvellously clear-fretted in the unsmoked air, the Abbey rose, silver-grey. It stood detached by the serenity of age from the ephemeral growths around it. It was solid on a foundation of centuries, destined perhaps for centuries yet to preserve within it the monuments to those whose work was now all destroyed. I did not loiter there. In years to come I expect some will go to look at the old Abbey with romantic melancholy, but romance of that kind is an alloy of tragedy with retrospect. I was too close. Moreover, I was beginning to experience something new, the fear of being alone. I had not been alone since I walked from the hospital along Piccadilly, and then there had been bewildering novelty in all I saw. Now, for the first time, I began to feel the horror that real loneliness holds for a species that is by nature gregarious. I felt naked, exposed to all the fears that prowled. I made myself drive up on Victoria Street. The sound of the car itself alarmed me with its echoes. My impulse was to leave it and sneak silently on foot, seeking safety and cunning like a beast in the jungle. It needed all my willpower to keep myself steady and hold to my plan. For I knew what I should have done had I chanced to be allocated to this district. I should have sought supplies in its biggest department store. Somebody had stripped the provision department of the Army and Navy stores all right, but there was no one there now. I came out by a side door. A cat on the pavement was engaged in sniffing at something which might have been a bundle of rags, but was not. I clapped my hands at it. It glared at me, then slunk off. A man came round a corner. He had a gloating expression on his face, and was perseveringly rolling a large cheese along the middle of the road. When he heard my step, he halted his cheese and sat on it, brandishing his stick fiercely. I went back to my car in the main street. The probability was that Josella too would have chosen a hotel as a convenient headquarters. I remembered that there were several around Victoria Station, so I drove on there. It turned out that there were vastly more of them than I had thought. After I had looked into a score or more without finding any evidence of organized squatting, it began to seem pretty hopeless. I looked for someone to ask. There seemed a chance that anyone still alive here might owe it to her. I had seen only half a dozen capable of moving since I arrived in the district. Now there seemed to be none. But at last, near the corner of Buckingham Palace Road, I came across an old woman sitting huddled on a doorstep. She was tearing at a tin with broken fingernails, and alternately cursing and whimpering over it. I went to a small shop nearby and found half a dozen tins of beans overlooked on a high shelf. I discovered a tin opener too, and went back to her. She was still futilely scrabbling away at her tin. "You'd better throw that away. It's coffee," I told her. I put the opener into her hand and gave her a tin of beans. "Listen to me," I said. "Do you know anything of a girl round here, a girl that can see?" She'd be in charge of a party, most likely. I was not very hopeful, but something must have helped the old woman to keep going longer than most. It seemed almost too good to be true when she nodded. "Yes," she said as she started the opener. "You do? Where is she?" I demanded. Somehow it never occurred to me that it could be anyone but Josella. But she shook her head. "I don't know. I was with her lot for a bit, but I lost 'em. An old woman like me can't keep up with the young one, so I lost 'em. They'd not wait for a poor old woman, and I could never find 'em again." She went on cutting intently round the tin. "Where is she living?" I asked. "We was all in a hotel. Don't know where it is, or I'd have found 'em again." "Don't you know the name of the hotel?" "Not me. T'ain't no good knowing the names of places when you can't see to read 'em, nor nobody else can't neither." "But you must remember something about it." "No, I don't." She lifted the can and sniffed cautiously at the contents. "Look here," I said coldly. "You want to keep those tins, don't you?" She made a movement with one arm to gather them all to her. "Well, then you better tell me all you can about that hotel," I went on. "You must know, for instance, whether it was large or small." She considered, one arm still protectively about the tins. "Downstairs it sounded sort of hollow, like it might be biggish. Likely it was smart, too. What I mean, it had them quiet carpets and good beds and good sheets." "Nothing else about it?" "No, not as I—" "Yes, there was, though. It had 2 small steps outside, and you went in through one of them round and round doors." "That's better," I said. "You're quite sure of that? If I can't find it, I can find you again, you know." "It's God's truth, mister. 2 small steps and round door." She rummaged in a battered bag beside her, brought out a dirty spoon, and began to taste the beans as if they were one of the jams of paradise. There were, I found, still more hotels round there than I had thought, and a surprising number of them had round and round doors. But I kept on. There was no mistaking it when I did find it. The traces and the smell were all too familiar. "Anybody here?" I called in the echoing lounge. I was about to go further in when a groan came from one corner. Over in a semi-dark recess a man was lying on a settee. Even in the dimness it was possible to see that he was far gone. I did not go too close. His eyes opened. For a moment I thought that he could see. "You there?" he said. "Yes, I want—" "Water," he said. "For Christ's sake, give me some water." I went across to the dining room and found the service room beyond. The taps were dry. I squirted a couple of siphons into a big jug and took it back with a cup. I put them down where he could reach them. "Thanks, mate," he said. "I can manage. You keep clear of me." He dipped the cup into the jug and then drained it. "God," he said, "did I need that?" And he repeated the action. "What you doing, mate? T'ain't healthy round here, no?" "I'm looking for a girl who can see. Her name's Josella. Is she here?" "She was here, but you're too late, chum." A sudden suspicion struck me like a physical stab. "You don't mean—" "No, ease off, mate. She ain't got what I got. No, she's just gone. Same as all the rest what could." "Where did she go, do you know?" "Can't tell you that, mate." "I see," I said heavily. "You'd best be going too, chum. Hang around here long and you'll be staying for keeps like me." He was right. I stood looking down at him. "Anything else I can get you?" "No, this'll last me. I reckon it won't be much longer I'll need anything." He paused. Then he added, "Bye, mate. Thanks a lot. And if you do find her, look after her proper. She's a good girl." While I was making a meal of tinned ham and bottled beer a little later, it occurred to me that I had not asked the man when Josella had left, but I decided that in his state he would be unlikely to have any clear idea of time. The one place I could think of to go to was the university building. I reckoned Josella would think the same, and there was a hope that some others of our dispersed party might have drifted back there in an effort to reunite. It was not a very strong hope, but common sense should have caused them to leave the town days ago. 2 flags still hung above the tower, limp in the warm air of the early evening. Of the 24 or so lorries that had been accumulated in the forecourt, 4 still stood there, apparently untouched. I parked the car beside them and went into the building. My footsteps clattered in the silence. "Hello? Hello there?" I called. "Is there anyone here?" My voice echoed away down corridors and up wells, diminishing to the parody of a whisper, and then to silence. I went to the doors of the other wing and called again. Once more the echoes died away unbroken, settling softly as dust. Only then as I turned back did I notice that an inscription had been chalked on the wall inside the outer door. In large letters it gave simply an address. Tynesham Manor, Tynesham, near Devizes, Wilts. That was something, at least. I looked at it, and thought. In another hour or less it would be dusk. Devizes, I guessed, at 100 miles distant, probably more. I went outside again and examined the lorries. One of them was the last that I had driven in, the one in which I had stowed my despised anti-Triffid gear. I recalled that the rest of its load was a useful assortment of food and supplies. It would be much better to arrive with that than empty-handed in a car. Nevertheless, if there were no urgent reason for it, I did not fancy driving anything, much less a large, heavily loaded lorry, by night along roads which might reasonably be expected to produce a number of hazards. If I were to pile it up, and the odds were that I should, I would lose a lot more time in finding another and transferring the load than I would by spending the night here. An early start in the morning offered much better prospects. I moved my boxes of cartridges from the car to the cab of the lorry in readiness. The gun I kept with me. I found the room from which I had rushed to the fake fire alarm exactly as I had left it. My clothes on a chair, even the cigarette case and lighter where I had placed them beside my improvised bed. It was still too early to think of sleep. I lit a cigarette, put the case in my pocket, and decided to go out. Before I went into the Russell Square garden, I looked it over carefully. I had already begun to be suspicious of open spaces. Sure enough, I spotted one Triffid. It was in the northwest corner, standing perfectly still, but considerably taller than the bushes that surrounded it. I went closer, and blew the top of it to bits with a single shot. The noise in the silent square could scarcely have been more alarming if I had let off a howitzer. When I was sure that there were no others lurking, I went into the garden and sat with my back against a tree. I stayed there perhaps 20 minutes. The sun was low, and half the square was thrown into shadow. Soon I would have to go in. While there was light, I could sustain myself. In the dark, things could steal quietly upon me. Already I was on my way back to the primitive. Before long, perhaps, I should be spending the hours of darkness in fear as my remote ancestors must have done, watching ever distrustfully the night outside their cave. I delayed to take one more look around the square as if it were a page of history I would learn before it was turned. And as I stood there, I heard the gritting of footsteps on the road, a slight sound, but as loud in the silence as a grinding millstone. I turned with my gun ready. Crusoe was no more startled at the sight of a footprint than I at the sound of a footfall, for it had not the hesitancy of a blind man's. I caught a glimpse in the dim light of the moving fire. As it left the road and entered the garden, I saw that it was a man. Evidently he had seen me before I heard him, for he was coming straight towards me. "You don't need to shoot," he said, holding empty hands wide apart. I did not know him until he came within a few yards. Simultaneously, he recognized me. "Oh, it's you, is it?" he said. I kept the gun raised. "Hello, Coker. What are you after? Wanting me to go on another of your little parties?" I asked him. "No. You can put the thing down. Makes too much noise, anyway. That's how I found you." "No," he repeated. "I've had enough. I'm getting to hell out of here." "So am I," I said, and lowered the gun. "What happened to your bunch?" he asked. I told him. He nodded. "Same with mine. Same with the rest, I expect. Still, we tried. The wrong way, I said. He nodded again. Yes, he admitted. I reckon your lot did have the right idea from the start. Only it didn't look right. And it didn't sound right a week ago. 6 days ago, I corrected him. A week, said he. No, I'm sure. Oh, well, what the hell's it matter anyway, I said. In the circumstances, I went on, what do you say to declaring an amnesty and starting over again? He agreed. I've got it wrong, he repeated. I thought I was the one who was taking it seriously, but I wasn't taking it seriously enough. I couldn't believe that it would last, or that some kind of help wouldn't show up. But now look at it. And it must be like this everywhere. Europe, Asia, America. Think of America smitten like this. But they must be. If they weren't, they'd have been over here, helping out and getting the place straight. That's the way it'd take them. No, I reckon your lot understood it better from the start. We ruminated for some moments, then I asked, this disease, plague, what do you reckon it is? Search me, chum. I thought it must be typhoid, but someone said typhoid takes longer to develop, so I'd not know. I don't know why I've not caught it myself, except that I've been able to keep away from those that have, and to see that what I was eating was clean. I've been keeping to tins I've opened myself, and I've drunk only bottled beer. Anyway, though I've been lucky so far, I don't fancy hanging around here much longer. Where do you go now? I told him of the address chalked on the wall. He had not yet seen it. He had been on his way to the university building when the sound of my shot had caused him to scout round with some caution. I began, and then stopped abruptly. From one of the streets west of us came the sound of a car starting. It ran up its gears quickly, and then diminished into the distance. Well, at least there's somebody else left, said Coker. And whoever wrote up that address. Have you any idea who that would be? I shrugged my shoulders. It was a justifiable assumption that it was a returned member of the group that Coker had raided, or possibly some sighted person that his party had failed to catch. There was no telling how long it had been there. He thought it over. It'll be better if there's two of us. I'll tag along with you and see what's doing, okay? Okay, I agreed. I'm for turning in now, and an early start tomorrow. He was still asleep when I awoke. I dressed myself much more comfortably in the ski suit and heavy shoes than in the garments I had been wearing since his party had provided them for me. By the time I returned with a bag of assorted packets and tins, he was up and dressed too. Over breakfast we decided to improve our welcome at Tynesham by taking a loaded lorry each rather than travel together in one. And see that the cab window closes, I suggested. There are quite a lot of Triffid nurseries around London, particularly to the west. Uh-huh. I've seen a few of the ugly brutes about, he said, offhandedly. I've seen them about and in action, I told him. At the first garage we came to, we broke open a pump and filled up. Then, sounding in the silent streets like a convoy of tanks, we set off westwards with my 3-tonner in the lead. The going was wearisome. Every few dozen yards one had to weave round some derelict vehicle. Occasionally 2 or 3 together would block the road entirely so that it was necessary to go dead slow and nudge one of them out of the way. Very few of them were wrecked. The blindness seemed to have come upon the drivers swiftly, but not too suddenly for them to keep control. Usually they had been able to draw into the side of the road before they stopped. Had the catastrophe occurred by day, the main roads would have been quite impassable, and to work our way clear from the centre by side streets might have taken days, spent mostly in reversing before impenetrable thickets of vehicles and trying to find another way round. As it was, I found that our overall progress was less slow than it seemed in detail, and when, after a few miles, I noticed an overturned car beside the road, I realized that we were by this time on a route which others had followed and partially cleared ahead of us. On the further outskirts of Staines we could begin to feel that London was behind us at last. I stopped and went back to Coker. As he switched off, the silence closed, thick and unnatural, with only the click of cooling metal to break it. I realized suddenly that I had not seen a single living creature other than a few sparrows since we had started. Coker climbed out of his cab. He stood in the middle of the road, listening and looking around him. "And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity," he murmured. I looked hard at him. His grave, reflective expression turned suddenly to a grin. "Or do you prefer Shelley?" he asked. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." "Come on, let's find some food." "Coca," I said, as we completed the meal sitting on a store counter and spreading marmalade on biscuits. "You beat me. What are you? The first time I meet you, I find you ranting, if you will forgive the appropriate word, in a kind of dockside lingo. Now you quote Marvel to me. It doesn't make sense." He grinned. "Never did to me either," he said. "It comes of being a hybrid. You never really know what you are. My mother never really knew what I was either. At least she never could prove it. And she always held it against me that on account of that she could not get an allowance for me. It made me kind of sour about things when I was a kid. And when I left school, I used to go to meetings. More or less any kind of meetings as long as they were protesting against something. And that led to me getting mixed up with the lot that used to come to them. I suppose they found me kind of amusing. Anyway, they used to take me along to arty political sorts of parties. After a bit I got tired of being amusing and seeing them give a kind of double laugh, half with me and half at me, whenever I said what I thought. I reckoned I needed some of the background knowledge they had, and then I'd be able to laugh at them a bit, maybe. So I started going to evening classes, and I practiced talking the way they did for use when necessary. There's a whole lot of people don't seem to understand that you have to talk to a man in his own language before he'll take you seriously. If you talk tough and quote Shelley, they think you're cute, like a performing monkey or something, but they don't pay any attention to what you say. You have to talk the kind of lingo they're accustomed to taking seriously. And it works the other way, too. Half the political intelligentsia who talk to a working audience don't get the value of their stuff across. Not so much because they're over their audience's heads, as because most of the chaps are listening to the voice and not to the words, so they knock a big discount off what they do here because it's all a bit fancy and not like ordinary normal talk. So I reckon the thing to do was to make myself bilingual, and use the right one in the right place, and occasionally the wrong one in the wrong place, unexpectedly. Surprising how that jolts them. Wonderful thing, the English caste system. Since then I've made out quite nicely in the orating business. Not what you'd call a steady job, but full of interest and variety. Wilfred Coker. Meetings addressed. Subject, no object, that's me. How do you mean, subject, no object? I inquired. Well, I kind of supply the spoken word just like a printer supplies the printed word. He doesn't have to believe everything he prints. I left that for a moment. How's it happen you're not like the rest? I asked. You weren't in hospital, were you? Me? No. It just so happened that I was addressing a meeting that was protesting over police partiality in a little matter of a strike. We began about 6 o'clock, and about past the police themselves arrived to break it up. I found a handy trap door and went down into the cellar. They came down too to have a look, but they didn't find me where I'd gone to earth in a pile of shavings. They went on tramping around up above for a bit, then it was quiet. But I stayed put. I wasn't walking out into any nice little trap. It was quite comfortable there, so I went to sleep. In the morning, when I took a careful nose around, I found all this had happened. He paused thoughtfully. Well, that racket's finished. Certainly doesn't look as if there's going to be much call for my particular gifts from now on, he added. I did not dispute it. We finished our meal. He slid himself off the counter. Come on, we'd better be shifting. Tomorrow to fresh fields and pastures new, if you'd care for a really hackneyed quotation this time. It's more than that, it's inaccurate, I said. It's woods, not fields. He frowned and thought. Well, bugger me, mate, so it is, he admitted. I began to feel the lightening of spirit that Coco was already showing. The sight of the open country gave one hope of a sort. It was true that the young green crops would never be harvested when they had ripened, nor the fruit from the trees gathered, that the countryside might never again look as trim and neat as it did that day. But for all that, it would go on, after its own fashion. It was not like the towns, sterile, stopped forever. It was a place one could work and tend, and still find a future. It made my existence of the previous week seem like that of a rat living on crumbs and ferreting in garbage heaps. As I looked out over the fields, I felt my spirits expanding. Places on our route, towns like Reading or Newbury, brought back the London mood for a while, but they were no more than dips in a graph of revival. There is an inability to sustain the tragic mood, a phoenix quality of the mind. It may be helpful or harmful, it is just a part of the will to survive. Yet, also, it has made it possible for us to engage in one weakening war after another. But it is a necessary part of our mechanism that we should be able to cry only for a time over even an ocean of spilt milk. The spectacular must soon become the commonplace, if life is to be supportable. Under a blue sky where a few clouds sailed like celestial icebergs, the cities became a less oppressive memory, and the sense of living freshened us again like a clean wind. It does not perhaps excuse, but it does at least explain why from time to time I was surprised to find myself singing as I drove. At Hungerford we stopped for more food and fuel. The feeling of release continued to mount as we passed through miles of untouched country. It did not seem lonely yet, only sleeping and friendly. Even the sight of occasional little groups of Triffids swaying across a field, or of others resting with their roots dug into the soil, held no hostility to spoil my mood. They were, once again, the simple objects of my suspended professional interest. Short of devices, we pulled up once more to consult the map. A little further on, we turned down a side road to the right, and drove into the village of Tynesham.
End of Disc 5. Disc 6.
Chapter 10. Tynesham. There was little likelihood of anyone missing the manor. Beyond the few cottages which constituted the village of Tynesham, the high wall of an estate ran beside the road. We followed it until we came to massive wrought-iron gates. Behind them stood a young woman on whose face the sober seriousness of responsibility had suppressed all human expression. She was equipped with a shotgun, which she clasped in inappropriate places. I signalled to Coker to stop, and called to her as I drew up. Her mouth moved, but not a word penetrated the clatter of the engine. I switched off. "This is Tynesham Manor?" I asked. She was not giving that or anything else away. "Where are you from? And how many of you?" she countered. I could have wished that she did not fiddle about with her gun in just the way she did. Briefly, and keeping an eye on her uneasy fingers, I explained who we were, why we came, roughly what we carried, and guaranteed that there were no more of us hidden in the trucks. I doubted whether she was taking it in. Her eyes were fixed on mine with a mournfully speculative expression more common in bloodhounds, but not reassuring even there. My words did little to disperse the random suspicion which makes the highly conscientious so wearing. As she emerged to glance into the backs of the lorries and verify my statements, I hoped for her sake that she would not chance to encounter a party of whom her suspicions were justified. Admission that she was satisfied would have weakened her role of reliability, but she did eventually consent, still with reserve, to allow us in. "Take the right fork," she called up to me as I passed, and turned back at once to attend to the security of the gates. Beyond a short avenue of elms lay a park landscaped in the manner of the late 18th century, and dotted with trees which had had space to expand into full magnificence. The house, when it came into view, was not a stately home in the architectural sense, but there was a lot of it. It rambled over a considerable ground area, and through a variety of building styles, as though none of its previous owners had been able to resist the temptation to leave his personal mark upon it. Each, while respecting the work of his forefathers, had apparently felt it incumbent upon him to express the spirit of his own age. A confident disregard of previous levels had resulted in a sturdy waywardness. It was inescapably a funny house, yet friendly and reliable-looking. The right fork led us to a wide courtyard where several vehicles stood already. Coach houses and stables extended around it, seemingly over several acres. Coker drew up alongside me and climbed down. There was no one in sight. We made our way through the open rear door of the main building and down a long corridor. At the end of it was a kitchen of baronial capacity where the warmth and smell of cooking lingered. From beyond a door on the far side came a murmur of voices and a clatter of plates, but we had to negotiate a further dark passage and another door before we reached them. The place we entered had, I imagine, been the servants' hall in the days when staffs were sufficiently large for the term to be no misnomer. It was spacious enough to seat 100 or more at tables without crowding. The present occupants, seated on benches at 2 long trestles, I guessed to number between 50 and 60, and it was clear at a glance that they were blind. While they sat patiently, a few sighted persons were very busy. Over at a side table, 3 girls were industriously carving chickens. I went up to one of them. "We've just come," I said. "What do we do?" She paused, still clutching her fork, and pushed back a lock of hair with the crook of her wrist. "It'll help if one of you takes charge of the veg and the other helps with the plates," she said. I took command of 2 large tubs of potato and cabbage. In the intervals of doling them out, I looked over the occupants of the hall. Josella was not amongst them, nor could I see any of the more notable characters among the group that had put forward its proposals at the university building, though I fancied I had seen the faces of some of the women before. The proportion of men was far higher than in the former group, and they were curiously assorted. A few of them might have been Londoners, or at least town-dwellers, but the majority wore a countryman's working clothes. An exception to either kind was a middle-aged clergyman, but what every one of the men had in common was blindness. The women were more diversified. Some were in town clothes quite unsuited to their surroundings, others were probably local. Among the latter group only one girl was sighted, but the former group comprised 6 or so who could see, and a number who, though blind, were not clumsy. Coker, too, had been taking stock of the place. "Rum sort of set-up, this," he remarked sotto voce to me. "Have you seen her yet?" I shook my head, desolately aware that I had pinned more on the expectation of finding Josella there than I had admitted to myself. "Funny thing," he went on, "there's practically none of the lot I took along with you, except that girl that's carving up at the end there." "Has she recognized you?" I said. "I think so. I got a sort of dirty look from her." When the carrying and serving had been completed, we took our own plates and found places at the table. There was nothing to complain of in the cooking or the food, and living out of cold cans for a week sharpens the appreciation anyway. At the end of the meal there was a knocking on the table. The clergyman rose. He waited for silence before he spoke. "My friends, it is fitting that at the end of another day we should renew our thanks to God for his great mercy in preserving us in the midst of such disaster. I will ask you all to pray that he may look with compassion upon those who still wander alone in darkness, and that it may please him to guide their feet hither that we may succour them. Let us all beseech him that we may survive the trials and tribulations that lie ahead, in order that in his time and with his aid we may succeed in playing our part in the rebuilding of a better world, to his greater glory." He bowed his head. "Almighty and most merciful God." After the Amen, he led a hymn. When that was finished, the gathering sorted itself out into parties, each keeping touch with his neighbour, and 4 of the sighted girls led them out. I lit a cigarette. Coker took one from me absent-mindedly without making any comment. A girl came across to us. "Will you help to clear up?" she asked. "Miss Durrant will be back soon, I expect." "Miss Durrant," I repeated. "She does the organising," she explained. "You'll be able to fix things up with her." It was an hour later and almost dark when we heard that Miss Durrant had returned. We found her in a small study-like room lit only by 2 candles on the desk. I recognized her at once as the dark, thin-lipped woman who had spoken for the opposition at the meeting. For the moment, all her attention was concentrated on Coker. Her expression was no more amiable than upon the former occasion. "I am told," she said coldly, regarding Coker as though he was some kind of silt. "I am told that you are the man who organized the raid on the university building." Coker agreed, and waited. "Then I may as well tell you once and for all that in our community here we have no use for brutal methods and no intention of tolerating them." Coker smiled slightly. He answered her in his best middle-class speech. "It is a matter of viewpoint. Who is to judge who were the more brutal, those who saw an immediate responsibility and stayed, or those who saw a further responsibility and cleared out?" She continued to look hard at him. Her expression remained unchanged, but she was evidently forming a different judgment of the type of man she had to deal with. Neither his reply nor its manner had been quite what she had expected. She shelved that aspect for a time and turned to me. "Were you in that too?" she asked. I explained my somewhat negative part in the affair and put my own question. "What happened to Michael Beadley, the Colonel and the rest?" It was not well received. "They have gone elsewhere," she said sharply. "This is a clean, decent community with standards, Christian standards, and we intend to uphold them. We have no place here for people of loose views. Decadence, immorality, and lack of faith were responsible for most of the world's ills. It is the duty of those of us who have been spared to see that we build a society where that does not happen again. The cynical and the clever will find that they are not wanted here, no matter what brilliant theories they may put forward to disguise their licentiousness and their materialism. We are a Christian community, and we intend to remain so." She looked at me challengingly. "So you split, did you?" I said. "Where did they go?" She replied stonily. "They moved on, and we stayed here. That is what matters. So long as they keep their influence away from here, they may work out their own damnation as they please. And since they choose to consider themselves superior to both the laws of God and civilized custom, I have no doubt that they will." She ended this declaration with a snap of the jaw which suggested that I should be wasting my time if I tried to question further, and turned back to Coker. "What can you do?" she inquired. "A number of things," he said calmly. "I suggest that I make myself generally useful until I see where I am needed most." She hesitated, a little taken aback. It had clearly been her intention to make the decision and issue the instruction, but she changed her mind. "All right. Look round, and come and talk it over tomorrow evening," she said. But Coker was not to be dismissed quite so easily. He wanted particulars of the size of the estate, the number of persons at present in the house, the proportion of sighted to blind, along with a number of other matters, and he got them. Before we left, I put in a question about Josella. Miss Durrant frowned. "I seem to know that name. Now, where— Oh, did she stand in the Conservative interest in the last election?" "I don't think so. She, did write a book once," I admitted. She began. Then I saw recollection dawn. Oh, that. Well, really, Mr. Mason, I can scarcely think she would be the sort of person to care for in the kind of community we are building here." In the corridor outside, Coker turned to me. There was just enough of the twilight left for me to see his grin. "A somewhat oppressive orthodoxy around these parts," he remarked. The grin disappeared as he added, "Rum type, you know. Pride and Prejudice. She's wanting help. She knows she needs it badly, but nothing's going to make her admit it." He paused opposite an open door. It was almost too dark now to make out anything in the room, but when we had passed it before, there had been enough light to reveal it as a men's dormitory. "I'm going in to have a word with these chaps. See you later." I watched him stroll into the room and greet it collectively with a cheerful, "Whatcha, mates? How's it going?" and then made my own way back to the dining hall. The only light there came from 3 candles set close together on one table. Close beside them a girl peered exasperatedly at some mending. "Hello," she said. "Awful, isn't it? How on earth did they manage to do anything after dark in the old days?" Not such old days either, I told her. This is the future as well as the past, provided there's somebody to show us how to make candles. I suppose so. She raised her head and regarded me. You came from London today? Yes, I admitted. It's bad there now. It's finished, I said. You must have seen some horrible sights there, she suggested. I did, I said briefly. How long have you been here? She gave me the general picture of things without more encouragement. Coker's raid on the university building had netted all but half a dozen of the sighted. She and Miss Durrant had been 2 of those overlooked. During the following day, Miss Durrant had taken somewhat ineffective charge. There had been no question of their leaving right away, since only one among them had ever attempted to drive a lorry. During that day and most of the next, they had been in almost the same relationship to their party as I was to mine away in Hampstead. But during the later part of the second day, Michael Beadley and 2 others returned, and during the night a few more had struggled back. By noon the day after that they had drivers for a dozen vehicles. They had decided that it was more prudent to leave forthwith than to wait on the chance that others would come. Tynesham Manor had been chosen as a tentative destination for little better reason than that it was known to the Colonel as a place which could offer the compact seclusion which was one of the qualities they sought. It had been an ill-assorted party, with its leaders well aware of the fact. The day after their arrival there had been a meeting, smaller but otherwise not unsimilar to that held earlier in the university building. Michael and his section had announced that there was much to be done, and that it was not their intention to waste their energies in pacifying a group which was shot through with petty prejudices and squabbles. The whole business was too big for that, and time too pressing. Florence Durrant agreed. What had happened to the world was warning enough. How anyone could be so blindly ungrateful for the miracle that had preserved them as even to contemplate the perpetuation of the subversive theories which had been undermining the Christian faith for a century she was unable to understand. For her part, she had no wish to live in a community where one section would be continually striving to pervert the simple faith of those who were not ashamed to show their gratitude to God by keeping his laws. She was no less able to see that the situation was serious. The proper course was to pay full heed to the warning God had given, and turn at once to his teaching. The division of parties, though clear, left them very uneven. Miss Durrant had found her supporters to consist of 5 sighted girls, a dozen or so blind girls, a few middle-aged men and women also blind, and no sighted males whatever. In the circumstances there could be no doubt whatever that the section which would have to move must be Michael Beadley's. With the lorries still loaded, there was little to delay them, and in the early afternoon they had driven away, leaving Miss Durrant and her followers to sink or swim by their principles. Not until then had there been an opportunity to survey the potentialities of the manor and its neighbourhood. The main part of the house had been closed, but in the servants' quarters they found traces of recent occupation. Investigation of the kitchen garden later gave a pretty clear picture of what had happened to those who had been looking after the place. The bodies of a man, a woman, and a girl lay close together there in a scatter of spilled fruit. Nearby a couple of Triffids waited patiently with their roots dug in. Close to the model farm at the far end of the estate was a similar state of affairs. Whether the Triffids had found their way into the park through some open gate, or some undocked specimens already there had broken free, was not clear, but they were a menace to be dealt with quickly before they could do more damage. Miss Durrant had sent off one sighted girl to make a circuit of the wall, closing every door or gate, and herself had broken into the gun-room. Despite inexperience, she and another young woman had succeeded in blowing the top off every Triffid they could find, to the number of 26. No more had been seen within the enclosure, and it was hoped that no more existed there. The following day's investigation of the village had shown Triffids about in considerable numbers. The surviving inhabitants were either those who had shut themselves into their houses to exist for as long as they could on what stores they had there, or those who had been lucky enough to encounter no Triffids when they made brief foraging sorties. All who could be found had been collected and brought back to the manor. They were healthy, and most of them were strong, but for the present at any rate they were more of a burden than a help, for there was not one of them that could see. 4 more young women had arrived in the course of the day. 2 had come driving a loaded lorry by turns and bringing a blind girl with them. The other had been alone in a car. After a brief look round, she had announced that she found the setup lacking in appeal, and driven on. Of the several who continued to arrive over the next few days, only 2 had stayed. All but 2 of the arrivals had been women. Most of the men, it seemed, had been more forthright and ruthless in extricating themselves from Coker's group formations, and most of them had returned in time to join the original party. Of Josella, the girl could tell me nothing. Clearly she had never heard the name before, and my attempts at description roused no recollections. While we were still talking, the electric lights in the room suddenly went on. The girl looked up at them with the awed expression of one receiving a revelation. She blew out the candles, and as she went on with her mending, she looked up at the bulbs occasionally as if to make certain they were still there. A few minutes later, Coker strolled in. "That was you, I suppose?" I said, nodding at the lights. "Yes," he admitted. "They got their own plant here. We might as well use up the petrol as let it evaporate." "Do you mean to say we could have had lights all the time we'd been here?" asked the girl. "If you'd just taken the trouble to start the engine," Coker said, looking at her. "If you wanted light, why didn't you try to start it?" "I didn't know it was there. Besides, I don't know anything about engines or electricity." Coker went on looking at her thoughtfully. "So you just went on sitting in the dark," he remarked. "And how long do you think you're likely to survive if you just go on sitting in the dark when things need doing?" She was stung by his tone. "It's not my fault if I'm not any good at things like that." "I'll differ there," Coker told her. "It's not only your fault, it's a self-created fault. Moreover, it's an affectation to consider yourself too spiritual to understand anything mechanical. It's a petty and a very silly form of vanity. Everyone starts by knowing nothing about anything, but God gives him, and even her, brains to find out with. Failure to use them is not a virtue to be praised. Even in women it is a gap to be deplored." She looked understandably annoyed. Coker himself had been looking annoyed from the time he came in. She said, "That's all very well, but different people's minds work on different lines. Men understand how machines and electricity work. Women just aren't much interested in that kind of thing as a rule." "Don't hand me a mess of myth and affectation. I'm not taking it," said Coker. "You know perfectly well that women can and do, or rather did, handle the most complicated and delicate machines when they took the trouble to understand them. What generally happens is that they're too lazy to take the trouble unless they have to. Why should they bother when the tradition of appealing helplessness can be rationalized as a womanly virtue, and the job just shoved off onto somebody else? Ordinarily, it's a pose that it's not worth anyone's while to debunk. In fact, it's been fostered. Men have played up to it by stoutly repairing the poor darling's vacuum cleaner and capably replacing the blown fuse. The whole charade has been acceptable to both parties. Tough practicality complements spiritual delicacy and charming dependence, and he is the mug who gets his hands dirty." He lunged on, well started now. "Hitherto, we have been able to afford to amuse ourselves with that kind of mental laziness and parasitism. In spite of generations of talk about the equality of the sexes, there has been much too great a vested interest in dependence for women to dream of dropping it. They have made a minimum of necessary modifications to changing conditions, but they have always been the minimum and grudged at that." He paused. "You doubt that? Well, consider the fact that both the pert chit and the intellectual woman worked the higher sensibility gag in their different ways, but when a war came, and brought with it a social obligation and sanction, both could be trained into competent engineers." "They weren't good engineers," she remarked. "Everybody says that." "Ah, the defensive mechanism in action. Let me point out that it was in nearly everybody's interest to say so." "All the same," he admitted. To some extent that was true. And why? Because nearly all of them not only had to learn hurriedly and without proper groundwork, but they also had to unlearn the habits carefully fostered for years of thinking such interests alien to them and too gross for their delicate natures. "I don't see why you have to come and pitch on me with all this," she said. "I'm not the only one who didn't start the wretched engine." Coker grinned. "You're quite right. It's unfair. It was simply finding the engine there ready to work and nobody doing a thing about it that started me off. Dumb futility gets me that way." "Then I think you might have said all that to Miss Durrant instead of me." "Don't worry, I shall. But it isn't just her affair, it's yours, and everyone else's. I mean that, you know. Times have changed rather radically. You can't any longer say, 'Oh dear, I don't understand this kind of thing,' and leave it to somebody else to do it for you. Nobody is going to be muddle-headed enough to confuse ignorance with innocence now. It's too important. Nor is ignorance going to be cute or funny anymore. It's going to be dangerous, very dangerous. Unless all of us get around as soon as we can to understanding a lot of things in which we had no previous interest, neither we nor those who depend on us are going to get through this lot. I don't see why you need to pour all your contempt for women onto me, just because of one dirty old engine, she said peevishly. Coker raised his eyes. Great God! And here have I been explaining that women have all the capacities if they only take the trouble to use them. You said we were parasites. That wasn't at all a nice thing to say. I'm not trying to say nice things, and what I did say was that in the world that has vanished, women had a vested interest in acting the part of parasites. And all that just because I don't happen to know anything about a smelly, noisy engine? Hell, said Coker, just drop that engine a minute, will you? Well, then why? The engine just happened to be a symbol. The point is, we'll all have to learn not simply what we like, but as much as we can about running a community and supporting it. The men can't just fill in a voting paper and hand the job to someone else, and it will no longer be considered that a woman has fulfilled all her social obligations when she has prevailed upon some man to support her and provide her with a niche where she can irresponsibly produce babies for somebody else to educate. Well, I don't see what that has to do with engines. Listen, said Coker patiently. If you have a baby, do you want him to grow up to be a savage or a civilized man? A civilized man, of course. Well, then, you have to see to it that he has civilized surroundings to do it in. The standards he'll learn from us. We've all got to understand as much as we can and live as intelligently as we can in order to give him the most we can. It's going to mean hard work and more thinking for all of us. Changed conditions must mean changed outlooks. The girl gathered up her mending. She regarded Coker critically for a few moments. With views like yours, I should think you'd find Mr. Beadley's party more congenial, she said. Here we have no intention of changing our outlook, or of giving up our principles. That's why we separated from the other party. So if the ways of decent, respectable people are not good enough for you, I should think you'd better go somewhere else. And with a sound very like a sniff, she walked away. Coker watched her leave. When the door closed, he expressed his feelings with a fish porter's fluency. I laughed. What did you expect? I said. You prance in and address the girl as if she were a public meeting of delinquents, and responsible for the whole Western social system as well. And then you're surprised when she's huffed. You'd expect her to see reason, he muttered. I don't see why. Most of us don't. We see habit. She'll oppose any modification, reasonable or not, that conflicts with her previously trained feelings of what is right and polite, and be quite honestly convinced that she's showing steadfast strength of character. You're in too much of a hurry. Show a man the Elysian fields when he's just lost his home, and he'll think mighty little of them. Leave him there a bit, and he'll begin to think home was like them, only cosier. She'll adapt in time as she has to, and continue to deny with conviction that she's done so. In other words, just improvise as necessary. Don't try to plan anything. That won't take us far. That's where leadership comes in. The leader does the planning, but he's wise enough not to say so. As the changes become necessary, he slips them in as a concession. Temporarily, of course, to circumstances, but if he's good, he's slipping in the right bits for the ultimate shape. There are always overwhelming objections to any plan, but concessions have to be made to emergencies. Sounds Machiavellian to me. I like to see what I'm aiming at and go straight for it. Most people don't, even though they protest that they do. They prefer to be coaxed or wheedled, or even driven. That way they never make a mistake. If there is one, it's always due to something or somebody else. This going headlong for things is a mechanistic view, and people in general aren't machines. They have minds of their own, mostly peasant minds at their easiest when they're in the familiar furrow. Doesn't sound as if you'd bet much on Beadley's chance of making a go of it. He's all plan. He'll have his troubles, but his party did choose. This lot is negative, I pointed out. It is simply here on account of its resistance to any kind of plan. I paused. Then I added, that girl was right about one thing, you know. You would be better off with his lot. Her reaction is a sample of what you'd get all round if you were to try to handle this lot your way. You can't drive a flock of sheep to market in a dead straight line, but there are ways of getting them there. You're being unusually cynical as well as metaphorical this evening, Coker observed. I objected to that. It isn't cynical to have noticed how a shepherd handles his sheep. or to regard human beings as sheep might be thought so by some, but less cynical and much more rewarding than regarding them as a lot of chassis fitted for remote thought control. Said Coker. I'll have to consider the implications of that. Chapter 11. And further on. My next morning was desultory. I looked around, I lent a hand here and there, and asked a lot of questions. It had been a wretched night. Until I lay down, I had not fully realized the extent to which I had counted on finding Josella at Tynesham. Weary though I was after the day's journey, I could not sleep. I lay awake in the darkness, feeling stranded and planless. So confidently had I assumed that she and the Beadley party would be there, that there had been no reason to consider any scheme beyond joining them. It now came home to me for the first time that even if I did succeed in catching up with them, I still might not find her. As she had only left Westminster District a short time before I arrived there in search of her, she must in any case have been well behind the main party. Obviously the thing to do was to make detailed inquiries regarding everyone who had arrived at Tynesham during the previous 2 days. For the present, I must assume that she had come this way. It was my only lead. And that meant assuming also that she had gone back to the university and had found the chalked address, whereas it was quite on the cards that she had not gone there at all, but sickened by the whole thing had taken the quickest route out of the reeking place that London had become. The thing I had to fight hardest against admitting was that she might have caught the disease, whatever it was, that had dissolved both our groups. I would not consider the possibility of that until I had to. In the sleepless clarity of the small hours I made one discovery. It was that my desire to join the Beadley party was very secondary indeed to my wish to find Josella. If, when I did find them, she was not with them, well, the next move would have to wait upon the moment, but it would not be resignation. Coker's bed was already empty when I awoke, and I decided to devote my morning chiefly to inquiries. One of the troubles was that it did not seem to have occurred to anyone to take note of the names of those who had found Tynesham uninviting and had passed on. Josella's name meant nothing to anyone save those few who recollected it with disapproval. My description of her raised no memories that would stand detailed examination. Certainly there had been no girl in a navy blue ski suit, that I established, but then I could by no means be certain that she would still be dressed in that way. My inquiries ended by making everyone very tired of me and increasing my frustration. There was a faint possibility that a girl who had come and gone a day before our arrival might have been she, but I could not feel it likely that Josella could have left so slight an impression on anyone's mind, even allowing for prejudice. Coker reappeared again at the midday meal. He had been engaged on an extensive survey of the premises. He had taken a tally of the livestock and the number of blind among it, inspected the farm equipment and machinery, found out about the source of pure water supplies, looked into the stores of feed, both human and stock, discovered how many of the blind girls had been afflicted before the catastrophe, and arranged classes of the others for them to train as best they could. He had found most of the men plunged in gloom by a well-meant assurance for the vicar that there would be plenty of useful things for them to do, such as basket-making and weaving, and he had done his best to dispel it with more hopeful prospects. Encountering Miss Durrant, he had told her that unless it could somehow be contrived that the blind women should take part of the work off the shoulders of the sighted, the whole thing would break down within 10 days. And also that if the vicar's prayer for more blind people to join them should happen to be granted, the place would become entirely unworkable. He was embarking upon further observations, including the necessity for starting immediately to build up food reserves, and to begin the construction of devices which would enable blind men to do useful work, when she cut him short. He could see that she was a great deal more worried than she would admit, but the determination which had led her to sever relations with the other party caused her to blaze back at him unthankfully. She ended by letting him know that on her information neither he nor his views were likely to harmonize with the community. "The trouble about that woman is that she means to be boss," he said. "It's constitutional, quite apart from the lofty principles." "Slanderous," I said. What you mean is that her principles are so impeccable that everything is her responsibility, and so it becomes her duty to guide others. Much the same thing, he said. But it sounds a lot better, I pointed out. He was thoughtful for a moment. She's going to run this place into one hell of a mess unless she gets right down to the job of organizing it pretty quickly. Have you looked the outfit over? I shook my head. I told him how my morning had been spent. You don't seem to have got much change for it. So, what? He said. I'm going on after the Michael Beadley crowd, I told him. And if she's not with them? At present, I'm just hoping she is. She must be. Where else would she be? He started to say something, then stopped. Then he went on. I reckon I'll come along with you. It's likely that crowd won't be any more glad to see me than this one, considering everything, but I can live that down. I've watched one lot fall to bits, and I can see this one's going to do the same, more slowly and maybe more nastily. It's queer, isn't it? Decent intentions seem to be the most dangerous things around just now. A damned shame, because this place could be managed, in spite of the proportion of blind. Everything it needs is lying about for the taking, and will be for a while yet. It's only organising that's wanted. And willingness to be organised, I suggest. That too, he agreed. You know, the trouble is that in spite of all that's happened, this thing hasn't got home to these people yet. They don't want to turn to. That'd be making it too final. At the back of their minds they're all camping out, hanging on, waiting for something or other. True, but scarcely surprising, I admitted. It took plenty to convince us, and they've not seen what we have. And somehow it does seem less final and less immediate out here in the country. Well, they've got to start realizing it soon if they're going to get through, Coker said, looking round the hall again. There's no miracle coming to save them. Give them time. They'll come to it as we did. You're always in such a hurry. Time's no longer money, you know. Money isn't important any longer, but time is. They ought to be thinking about the harvest, rigging a mill to grind flour, seeing about winter feed for the stock. I shook my head. Not as urgent as all that, Coker. There must be huge stocks of flour in the towns, and by the look of things, mighty few of us to use it. We can live on capital for a long while yet. Surely the immediate job is to teach the blind how to work before they really have to get down to it. All the same, unless something is done, the sighted ones here are going to crack up. It only needs that to happen to one or two of them, and the place will be a proper mess. I had to concede that. Later in the afternoon I managed to find Miss Durrant. No one else seemed to know or care where Michael Beadley and his lot had gone, but I could not believe that they had not left behind some indications for those who might follow. Miss Durrant was not pleased. At first I thought she was going to refuse to tell me. It was not due solely to my implied preference for other company. The loss of even an uncongenial, able-bodied man was serious in the circumstances. Nevertheless, she preferred not to show the weakness of asking me to stay. In the end, she said curtly, "They were intending to make for somewhere near Beaminster in Dorset. I can tell you no more than that." I went back and told Coker. He looked around him. Then he shook his head, though with a touch of regret. "Okay," he said. "We'll check out of this dump tomorrow." Spoken like a pioneer, I told him. At least, more like a pioneer than an Englishman. 9 o'clock the next morning saw us already 12 miles or so on our road, and travelling as before in our 2 lorries. There had been a question whether we should not take a handier vehicle, and leave the trucks for the benefit of the Tynessham people, but I was reluctant to abandon mine. I had personally collected the contents and knew what was in it. Apart from the case of anti-Triffid gear, of which Michael Beadley had so disapproved, I had given myself slightly wider scope on the last load, and there was a selection of things made with consideration of what might be difficult to find outside a large town. Such things as a small lighting set, some pumps, cases of good tools. All these things would be available later for the taking, but there was going to be an interlude when it would be advisable to keep away from towns of any size. The Tynessham people had the means to fetch supplies from towns where there was no sign yet of the disease. A couple of loads would not make a great deal of difference to them either way, so, in the end, we went as we had come. The weather still held good. On the higher ground there was still little taint in the fresh air, though most villages had become unpleasant. Rarely we saw a still figure lying in a field or by the roadside, but just as in London, the main instinct seemed to have been to hide away in shelter of some kind. Most of the villages showed empty streets.